For Queen Anne, the throne of England was paved with tragedy. Throughout her lifetime, she suffered a staggering 17 miscarriages and stillbirths, leaving her emotionally shattered and physically frail. Not just that, she experienced several delicate health struggles, which badly affected her reign. Join us as we explore Queen Anne's tragic life and how she managed to cope. A snippet of tragedy. Following Anne and George's marriage, they established their residence in the Cockpit, a collection of buildings within the Palace of Whitehall. This transition necessitated the hiring of a new staff, which significantly enhanced Anne's relationship with Sarah Jennings, who would later become Sarah Churchill. Sarah, hailing from a background of modest nobility, ascended to the position of one of Anne's ladies of the bedchamber, thereby elevating her social standing. With a newfound appreciation for the finer aspects of life, Sarah's ambition became insatiable. Within months, Anne became pregnant with her first child, though she unfortunately suffered a miscarriage. Undeterred, she and George persevered, ultimately welcoming 2 daughters over the next 2 years. The sudden death of her uncle, Charles II, in 1685, resulted in Anne's father ascending to the throne as the new King James. Anglicans were already discontent with James due to his Catholic faith, but their dissatisfaction intensified when he began appointing significant positions to his Catholic associates. Anne did not share her father's Catholic inclinations, leading to ongoing friction in their relationship. This already tenuous bond ultimately shattered when James attempted to compel Anne to baptize her second daughter as a Catholic. The year 1687 proved to be particularly devastating for Anne. She experienced another miscarriage, followed shortly by her husband contracting smallpox, which he inadvertently transmitted to their 2 infant daughters. While George eventually recovered, the girls were too young and frail to resist the illness, resulting in their deaths just days after Anne's second miscarriage. The lively palace transformed into a somber environment in the ensuing months, as the couple grieved together, sometimes weeping uncontrollably, and at other times enduring painful silence beside George's sickbed. Before the year concluded, Anne faced yet another stillbirth. Additionally, 1687 brought one more disappointment, which was that her stepmother became pregnant, and the birth of a son would likely mean that Anne's prospects for the throne were forever diminished. In June of 1688, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, an event that proved disastrous for both Anne and her sister Mary. This birth not only removed them from the line of succession, but also introduced a Catholic heir to the throne, which posed a significant threat to the Anglican population in England. And at this point, they knew that they needed to do something. So stay tuned to know how everything happened. Change in power. 5 months later, William and Mary launched an invasion of England, an event that would be termed the Glorious Revolution. The Anglican community, already discontent with their Catholic monarch, welcomed William and Mary enthusiastically. King James faced one of the most profound humiliations experienced by any English monarch, as he was ousted from his throne by his own daughter and her husband. With this turn of events, William and Mary ascended to the throne, restoring Anne's position in the line of succession. Throughout this challenging period, Sarah Churchill remained a close advisor to Anne, urging her to align with William and Mary rather than her father. Anne required little persuasion, and when King James discovered the betrayal by Anne, her husband, and the Churchills, he attempted to place them under house arrest. However, Anne and Sarah narrowly escaped capture by fleeing down a back staircase of Anne's palace, under the cover of darkness. Upon learning of Anne's escape, James reportedly lamented and begged God for help because his children had also abandoned him. Not only was Anne reinstated in the line of succession, but in 1689, she also gave birth to a son. Anne recognized that with her father deceased and her sister and brother-in-law assuming control, significant changes were imminent. She promptly inquired whether she could acquire Richmond Palace along with a substantial allowance from Parliament. To her astonishment, they declined her request, leading to escalating tensions between Anne and Mary. Additionally, Anne sought a military position for her husband, but William and Mary completely obstructed this ambition. It became increasingly clear to Anne that, despite being the next in line for the throne, the reigning monarchs were actively working to undermine her potential influence. Anne and Sarah Churchill shared a close bond, which drew some scrutiny due to the nature of their relationship, as one was a royal and the other a lady of the bedchamber. However, the dynamics of their connection remained largely hidden from public view. They exchanged affectionate nicknames, with Anne referring to herself as Mrs. Morley and Sarah as Mrs. Freeman, suggesting a sense of equality in their private moments. In contrast, Churchill held a rather low opinion of Anne, perceiving her as lacking in intellect and finding her company tedious. Following King James's departure, Sarah Churchill's loyalty to Anne began to yield benefits, as William and Mary elevated her husband to the title of Duke of Marlborough and granted him several significant political roles. Churchill had ascended to the rank of Duchess. However, within a few years, William and Mary began to recognize the significant influence that Sarah Churchill wielded over Queen Anne. In response to this realization, the Queen insisted that Anne dismiss Sarah. When Anne refused, Mary took decisive action, forcibly removing Sarah Churchill from the royal household. Frustrated with the situation, Mary dismissed Anne's honor guard, prohibited any courtiers from visiting her, and instructed all government officials to disregard Anne's statements. By this time, the animosity between the two sisters had escalated to a level nearly as intense as their mutual disdain for their father. A particularly cruel act by Mary would ultimately sever their relationship irreparably. Shortly after leaving the palace, Anne gave birth to another son, who tragically died mere minutes after his arrival. In her time of mourning, Anne was visited by her sister. However, if Anne anticipated that the Queen had come to express her condolences, she was gravely mistaken. Instead of offering sympathy for the loss of her nephew, Mary seized the moment to reprimand Anne for her continued friendship with Sarah. For Anne, who was already grieving the loss of her child, hearing her sister berate her about her closest companion became the breaking point. Following Mary's departure that day, the two sisters never reunited. Little did they know that they were about to face life squarely. Unplanned affliction. In 17th century England, social status was irrelevant when it came to the threat of smallpox, a disease that had the ability to afflict anyone. Following her final confrontation with Anne, Queen Mary contracted the illness and, after a brief and chaotic struggle, succumbed to it in 1694. Anne subsequently became the heir apparent, acutely aware that her father was biding his time in France, poised to reclaim his throne. This uncertain political situation was compounded by Anne's deteriorating health. She had never been robust, but her condition was worsening significantly. Eventually, she became so incapacitated that she required a wheelchair for mobility, necessitating the assistance of servants. As her health declined, so too did her appearance. She endured near constant pain, leading her to neglect her attire, which often appeared soiled and ragged. Her feet were frequently wrapped in painful bandages, and her complexion became ruddy and marked. As her so-called closest companion, Sarah Churchill, remarked, Anne became exceedingly unappealing and obese. Thus far, Anne's experiences had been nothing short of harrowing. The experience of motherhood for Anne was fraught with profound sorrow, culminating in July 1700, just months after enduring her 12th stillbirth. Her only surviving son was tragically taken from her at the tender age of 11. After nearly 2 decades of striving to bear children, she faced the devastating loss of her last child. Historians note that the death of her son plunged both Anne and her husband into deep mourning. The following year, Anne's father, the former King James, also passed away. Shortly after his death, Anne received a letter from her estranged stepmother, Mary of Modena, in which she implored Anne to restore her father's lineage by making her son king upon William's demise. In 1702, following King William's death, Anne ascended to the throne, and the English populace celebrated her reign, favoring her over the Catholic James. With Anne, they finally had a legitimate English Anglican monarch. However, her coronation was not without its challenges. Afflicted by severe gout, she was unable to walk to Westminster Abbey and required the assistance of servants to transport her in a sedan chair. During Anne's reign, England and Scotland united to form Great Britain, establishing a single parliament after centuries of conflict. Queen Anne's reign. Anne became the first queen of Great Britain, and her coronation likely represented a moment of vindication for Sarah Churchill, who had long aligned herself with this unlikely royal. At this juncture, Churchill had grown accustomed to having Anne heed her counsel. Abigail Hill was a cousin of Sarah Churchill, although from a less privileged branch of the family. While Churchill enjoyed the advantages of nobility, the Hill family faced significant hardships, compelling Abigail to seek employment as a servant. Sarah Churchill intervened to assist Abigail, though her motivations were likely rooted in a desire to avoid the embarrassment of having a relative in such a lowly position. Regardless of her intentions, Churchill brought Abigail into her household, which ultimately influenced both their destinies. In 1704, Abigail secured a position at Queen Anne's palace where she quickly endeared herself to the Queen. Unlike Sarah Churchill, who was characterized by her intensity, ambition, and domineering nature, Abigail was gentle, kind, and empathetic. Given that Anne had faced mistreatment from those around her throughout her life, Abigail's compassion provided a refreshing contrast. As their bond deepened, Sarah Churchill remained largely unaware of their growing closeness until it was too late. The Duchess of Marlborough, now a prominent figure, found herself increasingly occupied and spent little time at the royal palaces. Consequently, it took her several years to realize the extent of Anne and Abigail's relationship. When she finally uncovered this secret in 1707, 3 years after Abigail's arrival, she was left in a state of shock at the depth of their connection. Upon returning to Anne's palace, Sarah discovered that Abigail had taken residence in her former quarters, signaling her intention to usurp Sarah's position. In retaliation, Sarah commissioned a writer to produce a scandalous poem insinuating that Anne and Abigail were engaged in a romantic relationship. This poem ignited a flurry of rumors and gossip throughout the court. Furthermore, Sarah escalated her campaign by sending Anne a letter that included excerpts from the poem, accompanied by a menacing reminder that she possessed information that could jeopardize Anne's status. Although Anne had resigned herself to the idea of not having children, her life was not devoid of further tragedies. In 1708, the death of her cherished husband left her in a state of profound isolation, intensifying her need for support. Unfortunately, Sarah Churchill's lack of compassion following Prince George's death proved to be the final blow to their relationship. Following the tragic death of Prince George, a profound shift occurred in the dynamics between Queen Anne and her close confidant, Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. In the wake of this loss, Sarah began to assert an increasingly controlling influence over Anne, a move that was both surprising and distressing for the grieving queen. One of the first acts of this newfound dominance was Sarah's insistence on removing George's portrait from Anne's bedchamber, a deeply personal space where the queen sought solace and remembrance. This act was not merely a physical removal of an image, it symbolized Sarah's desire to dictate the terms of Anne's mourning and emotional expression. As Anne struggled to navigate her grief, she found herself increasingly subjected to Sarah's domineering behavior. Rather than providing the support and comfort that a friend should offer during such a difficult time, Sarah's actions felt more like an imposition. The situation grew more complicated with the introduction of Abigail Masham into their circle. Abigail, who had initially been a servant, began to gain favor with the queen, much to Sarah's annoyance. Sarah's disdain for Abigail was palpable. She openly criticized the queen for associating with her, dismissing Abigail as foolish and unworthy of the queen's attention. This criticism was not just a reflection of Sarah's feelings toward Abigail, but also a manifestation of her fear of losing her own influence over Anne. The tension between the three women escalated, with Sarah's harassment becoming increasingly intolerable. Anne, feeling cornered and disrespected, took the unusual step of reaching out to Sarah's husband, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. In her letter, she implored him to intervene, requesting that he instruct Sarah to cease her relentless teasing and to treat her with the dignity and respect that was due to both a friend and a queen. This plea highlighted the depth of Anne's distress and her desperation for a resolution to the turmoil that had invaded her personal life. Ultimately, the culmination of these events led Anne to a breaking point. No longer willing to endure the mistreatment from someone who had once been her closest confidant, she made a decisive choice to reclaim her agency. In a bold move, she formally accepted Sarah's resignation from her various positions at court, signaling a clear end to their once cherished friendship. As a final act of defiance against Sarah's overreach, Anne appointed Abigail as the keeper of the privy purse, a position of significant trust and responsibility. Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, ultimately miscalculated her position. Throughout her life, she had leveraged her friendship with Queen Anne to amass power. But this strategy had reached its conclusion. However, it is important to note that by the time of her death, At the age of 84, she had become one of the wealthiest women in Europe. Meanwhile, Queen Anne continued to bestow honors upon her cherished companion, Abigail. Despite Abigail's significant rise in status, she remained of low birth and faced considerable limitations in her actual influence. This dynamic shifted dramatically when Anne appointed 12 new peers to the House of Lords, an unprecedented action. Among these titles, Abigail's husband was granted a peerage, thereby elevating Abigail to the status of an official noble. On the same day that Abigail was made a baroness, Anne also dismissed Sarah Churchill's husband, the Duke of Marlborough, from his position as commander of the army. One admirable thing about Queen Anne was how she controlled everything irrespective of her deteriorating health. Queen Anne's struggles and scientific report. Queen Anne had struggled with poor health for most of her life, but her condition deteriorated significantly following her estrangement from Sarah Churchill. By March 1714, she was gravely ill, and after enduring months of sickness, she suffered a stroke on July 30th, from which she never recovered. She passed away on August 1st, and her physician, John Arbuthnot, regarded her death as a release from her prolonged suffering. Queen Anne undoubtedly endured a physical ailment that remained unrecognized during her lifetime, compounded by her persistent suffering. Her experiences with childbirth were particularly harrowing, and contemporary scientists, centuries later, have begun to hypothesize the underlying causes of her afflictions. Autoimmune disorders, such as lupus or Hughes syndrome, appear to be the most plausible explanations for her numerous traumatic pregnancies, as well as the chronic pain she faced throughout her life. In her later years, Anne became largely inactive and experienced significant obesity. Reports indicate that her coffin was so large that it required the strength of 14 men to transport it. However, this was not the most humiliating fate she encountered. Posthumously, Sarah Churchill, in her memoirs, disparaged Anne, portraying her as a foolish queen who would have achieved nothing without assistance. It is worth noting that Churchill held a condescending view of many individuals, not just Anne. Nevertheless, Anne's legacy is remarkable. As the second daughter of the king's brother, she outlived all her predecessors to ascend to the throne during a period of remarkable prosperity. She engaged more actively in parliamentary affairs than any monarch before her, and her reign witnessed extraordinary advancements in the arts, economy, science, and politics. Achievements made even more impressive by the numerous tragedies she endured. To fully understand everything that happened, we need to take a step back to the beginning of their lives and relationships. Maybe by doing this, we can connect the right dots to our understanding. Birth and subsequent years. Anne was born as the fourth child and second daughter of James, the Duke of York, who was the king's brother. At her birth, she was positioned fourth in the line of succession to the throne. However, the unpredictable nature of power dynamics, reminiscent of the Game of Thrones, soon led to the downfall of her rivals, one after another. Although her parents eventually had 8 children, only Anna and her elder sister Mary had already reached adulthood. Tragically, when Anne was merely 6 years old, her mother passed away from cancer, leaving Anne and her sister to live apart from their father in Richmond while he attended to state affairs. This period of separation left Anne feeling profoundly lonely and isolated. However, during her time in Richmond, she discovered a new source of companionship in Sarah Jennings, who was 5 years her senior, exceptionally intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. Their friendship blossomed and would significantly influence both of their lives. Shortly after Anne's introduction to Sarah, her father made headlines across England by converting to Catholicism and subsequently marrying the even more devout Mary of Modena, who was only 15 years old, just 6 years older than Anne. Over the next decade, James and Mary of Modena had 10 children, all of whom were either stillborn or did not survive infancy, a sorrow that Anne would come to understand all too well. In the context of numerous pregnancies, James arranged the marriage of Anne's sister to her cousin, the Dutch William of Orange. This political alliance appeared to be a prudent decision at the time. However, James would later come to regret this choice. By signing the marriage contract, he inadvertently sealed his own grim fate. In 1683, at the age of 18, Anne married the charming George of Denmark. Their relationship was characterized by mutual affection and unwavering devotion. Although it lacked a certain spark, Anne's connections with the women in her life compensated for this deficiency. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.